heard every word the prosecutor told him. The prosecutor was not a witness to anything in this case. Their words don't mean anything unless the witnesses come in here and convince all of you beyond every reasonable doubt. And that will not happen. Death is a terrible thing. Paul Cruikshank's death was a terrible thing. There's no question about that. But our aim in this courtroom, our one duty is to the truth.
Judge, objections, is there a proper reserve and statement?
Objections overruled.
Our duty is to the truth. And the truth is that Paul Cruikshank instigated the confrontation that brought about his death. That's what the evidence will show. The civilian witnesses, Mr. Garrett, some of the others that you hear from today, they're all well-intentioned, I'm sure. But you will hear that they either missed important parts of this confrontation, this case, or that they're simply mistaken. And the police officers, those charged with investigating this crime, were inexperienced in cases of this kind. They rushed to a judgment, and even with all their endless resources that the government provides them, they failed to make an adequate investigation into the case. This will be a hotly contested trial. Please do not get upset with us for fighting for Chris Freeze. Chris Freeze is 43 years old, moved to St. Augustine in around 2004 with his wife at the time. His parents, Paul and Laura Freeze, also lived in St. Augustine. They actually lived here before Chris. He also has an aunt and uncle here. The story of this case, ladies and gentlemen, is one of a chance encounter gone terribly wrong. Chris Freeze and Paul Cruikshank had never met before September 10th, 2011. As you've heard, they found themselves in an area of Volano Beach that includes Benito's restaurant, Italian food, not surprising, and a place called Haley's, which is a bar. There's also some apartments back there. There's an outdoor area where people circulate, and that's where these two men came to meet. Chris would go to that area often. He had friends that were employed at both places. And when Chris Freeze went out that day, he was starting to feel better on the heels of a very bad motorcycle accident. And you'll hear that this motorcycle accident the month before caused very serious head injuries to Mr. Freeze. He had a concussion, scar on the side of his head, and a big ugly scar right on his forehead. But it had been some weeks, and he was starting to feel up to it. So he went out. Did he bring his gun with him that day? He did. He had a valid permit to carry a firearm, met all the qualifications to carry it, and he brought it with him. As it turned out, ladies and gentlemen, he was going to need it. He was going to need it that day. Paul Cruikshank was a handful of a man. He was a stocky man, he was strong. People in St. Augustine knew him. He carried a reputation. The two men met each other at Haley's late that afternoon in that common area, the outdoor area. And their initial introduction was very unremarkable. Chris Freeze thought maybe he'd met him before. Hey, do I know you? No, I don't think so. We've never met. What's going on later tonight? Mr. Cruikshank told him that he thought about going downtown. And that was it. And they separated, went about their ways, as people were accustomed to do in that area. No issues or problems at that time. The next time Mr. Cruikshank came to the attention of Chris Freeze, however, he was giving someone a hard time. A small man by the name of Gianluca Brambilla. Chris Freeze noticed that Cruikshank was in Mr. Brambilla's face, so to speak. And so Chris Freeze walked over and told Mr. Cruikshank, hey, that's my friend, leave him alone. Cut it out. And Mr. Cruikshank did. It was fairly quick. He calmed that issue down, and the whole thing was over fairly quickly. Mr. Brambilla actually gave Mr. Freeze a couple bucks, and Mr. Freeze went in and got Mr. Cruikshank a beer because he had spilled the drink that he had during the words that the two men were having initially. So they went and got him a beer, put the same, quashed it right there. Mr. Bremby and Chris Freeze then went over to Benito's and found a group that they had known from previous encounters, two nice women and two boys, and went about their day. Thought nothing of it. Chatted with these nice women. Chris brought the two boys over to look at his motorcycle for a few minutes. The night was carrying on quite normally. Then Mr. Bremby went on his way, went home to his family, and Chris Freeze went back over to Haley's. Came back into contact with Mr. Cruikshank. And the two men talked. Mr. Cruikshank shared with Mr. Freeze that he had a cab on the way, was going to go downtown. Mr. Cruikshank invited Mr. Freeze to come along. Chris Freeze said, "I don't have any money. I'll just stick it out here." Mr. Cruikshank said, "No, don't worry about it. I got you covered. Come on along." And so, Mr. Freeze went with him. Took the cab down to the Giggling Gator, as you heard. The cab driver in that cab is a guy named Gary Jones. You'll hear that there was no antagonism in the cab ride. The one thing that was of note in the cab ride, however, was that Mr. Cruikshank was beginning to behave erratically. Very likely due to the onset of intoxication. He was making sense only part of the time, gave the cab driver a hard time about the fare, and things began to get uncomfortable. Two men were dropped off at the Giggling Gator, and they went to the bar, ordered a couple beers. And this is the point where the problem really began. Almost immediately upon entering the establishment, Mr. Cruikshank began saying bizarre things. Statements that made just enough sense to be troubled. Things like, "You don't know who I am. You don't know who my family is. You're going to find out." Chris Freeze didn't know if he was joking, didn't know if he was serious, wasn't sure what to make of it. However, Mr. Cruikshank then turned to Freeze and said, "You're going to pay for these beers, aren't you?" Mr. Freeze said, "Look, I told you I don't have any money." And with that, Mr. Cruikshank smacked Mr. Freeze on the forehead, right on the scar that he got from the motorcycle accident. Mr. Freeze, seeing this situation head downhill, left his practically full beer on the bar and headed towards the door. Mr. Freeze thought that was the end of it, but as he was heading out the door, he realized that Paul Cruikshank was at the door as well behind him, and that he was saying some more of these somewhat cryptic statements that sounded threatening. Mr. Freeze turned headed towards King Street, which is the street that runs right out in front of the bar. Next thing Chris Freeze knew, he was laying flat on the pavement face first. Mr. Cruikshank blindsided him, hit him from behind. He was flat. So he pulls himself up, scrambles back, still somewhat stunned, trying to figure out what had just taken place. And he turns and he sees Mr. Cruikshank continuing to move his way. They yelled at each other. They swore at each other. And when Mr. Cruikshank continued to advance in his direction, Chris Freeze pulled out his gun. He said, "I'll shoot you, or I'll kill you." Things you might say in such a situation. The gun caused Mr. Cruikshank to pause. He paused, and when Chris Freeze did not shoot him, he continued to come after him, and the two men began a struggle in the parking lot of the Giggling Gator. Arms swinging, moving back towards the business, they found themselves in a narrow area between the Giggling Gator and the first car parked off the deck area of the Giggling Gator. In this struggle, which began Obviously, both men on their feet, both men went to the ground. Mr. Cruikshank reached for the gun. Chris Fries did everything he could to keep that gun pointed at Mr. Cruikshank during the struggle, because both men's hands were clutching for this firearm. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a desperate struggle with a powerful man. And during that struggle, on the ground, the gun fired. Chris Fries did not intend to shoot Mr. Cruikshank at that fateful moment, but the gun discharged. And yes, officership was there. Officership heard the gun discharge. And very quickly had Mr. Fries in the backseat of a patrol car. Chris Fries was still in shock, not quite comprehending what took place. The reason why police were there so quickly is because of this man, Daniel Garrett, who worked at the Little Channel next door. He was the assistant manager, was taking the trash out. And the prosecutor told you that he was back in the store when he placed that 911 call. That's correct. He was inside his store. He could no longer see what he saw. What he saw was a slice of this confrontation between these two men. And from the time he placed that call, there is at least a minute and 20, if not more, that nobody saw. The gun was drawn when Mr. Garrett placed that phone call, and he's no longer watching. And a minute plus go by before the two men are on the ground, the gun goes off. Mr. Garrett also will tell you that he, from what he heard, thought that this confrontation was over a woman. You'll hear that law enforcement came to the conclusion that's just incorrect, and there's no evidence of that. So, calls into the question the slice that Mr. Garrett did witness. Nonetheless, the police latched on to what Mr. Garrett saw and what he heard. And they never looked back. They made up their minds as if it was a mathematical equation. Somebody heard Chris Fries say, "I'm going to kill you." Now there's a dead man, premeditated murder. That's it. Close the book. And now the prosecution has fallen in right behind. You will not hear that there is any motive for Chris Fries to harm Paul Cruikshank. You will hear that Paul Cruikshank was known to be a violent man. You will hear that he was very intoxicated, Mr. Cruikshank. He was acting erratically. He was capable of anything. And you will hear that there was a period of time during this confrontation where Chris Fries had every opportunity to shoot Paul Cruikshank. He didn't. He didn't do it. It happened on the ground, both men on the ground, in this struggle. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll have to do something that the government has not done. You'll have to keep in mind the presumption of innocence that Mr. Fries brings with him into this courtroom. We will make sure you remember that. We will endeavor through the cross-examination of these witnesses to fill in all the gaps and to let you know clearly that the government has misjudged this case. The government will push hard in this trial. We will push hard to try and get you to endorse that misjudgment.
Judge, I'm going to object again. This is supposed to be the evidence is going to show.
I'll sustain it for now, Mr. Coughlin.
I'm about to, Your Honor.
Okay.
The just verdict, when all of the evidence is in and you're instructed on the law, the just verdict will be for Chris Fries. He was attacked and he is innocent.
All right, thank you, Mr. Coughlin.